Rachel Anderson stared at the crumpled bills in her trembling hands, counting them for the fifth time. $237, her entire savings from 6 months of double shifts at Joe's Diner in Minneapolis. Her 4-year-old son Matthew sat quietly beside her on their worn sofa, clutching his favorite blue dinosaur toy, unaware of the weight pressing down on his mother's shoulders. The letter from the Phoenix Children's Hospital lay open on their scratched coffee table. A renowned pediatric surgeon had agreed to evaluate Matthew's heart condition, but the consultation was in 3 days. Rachel had already sold everything valuable they owned, picking up extra shifts whenever possible, but airline tickets remained frustratingly out of reach. "When are we going to see the special doctor, Mummy?" Matthew's innocent question made her heart ache. His small face was already showing signs of fatigue, his lips slightly bluish, a constant reminder of his congenital heart condition. "Soon, baby," she whispered, running her fingers through his soft brown curls. The truth was more complicated. The consultation could change everything, offering hope for Matthew's future, but getting to Phoenix seemed impossible. Their ancient car wouldn't survive the journey, and bus travel was too risky with Matthew's condition. That evening, while preparing Matthew's dinner, Rachel's phone rang. It was her younger sister Jennifer calling with unexpected news. "Listen, I found someone selling buddy passes for half price. They're good for any domestic flight, but you have to use them tomorrow. It's still expensive, but—" Rachel's hands shook as she wrote down the details. The discounted tickets would cost $400, still far more than she had, but closer to possible than ever before. After tucking Matthew into bed, she sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and her tip money jar. The next morning, Rachel arrived early at Joe's Diner, her uniform freshly pressed despite its worn edges. Her manager, Mike, noticed her red-rimmed eyes but didn't pry. He'd known Rachel for 3 years, watching her struggle and persist with quiet dignity. During her morning shift, Rachel served coffee to her regular customers, many of whom asked about Matthew. The diner had become a second family over the years, with regulars watching Matthew grow from a baby to a preschooler. They knew about his heart condition, had witnessed his occasional spells of breathlessness. Around noon, an elegantly dressed woman sat in Rachel's section, ordering only coffee while working on her laptop. As Rachel refilled her cup, she noticed the woman's airline employee badge. Gathering her courage, Rachel briefly shared their situation. The woman, Linda Peterson, listened with genuine concern, but explained she couldn't help directly. Airline policy was strict about employee travel passes. However, she wrote down Rachel's number, promising to ask around her network of flight attendants. By the end of her shift, Rachel's tips totaled $68, better than usual, but nowhere near enough. As she counted out her money in the break room, Mike appeared with surprising news. The morning's customers, having overheard her story, had left additional donations. "It's not much," he said gruffly, sliding an envelope across the table, "but we all care about that boy of yours." Inside was $175, servers and cooks giving what they could from their own tight budgets. Rachel's vision blurred with tears as she hugged Mike. Combined with her savings and today's tips, they were still short, but closer than ever to their goal. That afternoon, while picking up extra supplies at the corner store, Rachel's phone buzzed with a message from Linda. An off-duty pilot was willing to help, but they needed to decide immediately. There were 2 seats available on tomorrow morning's 6 a.m. flight to Phoenix. Rachel's hands trembled as she called Jennifer, who immediately offered her credit card to cover the remaining balance. "You can pay me back slowly," her sister insisted. "Matthew needs this." Racing home to pack, Rachel found her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, watching Matthew. The kind woman had already fed him dinner and helped him with his medication. "Go, Mijita," she said, seeing Rachel's agitation. "I'll watch him while you prepare." As Rachel packed their small suitcase that evening, Matthew sat on his bed holding his dinosaur and watching her with curious eyes. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement despite his obvious fatigue. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to see that special doctor tomorrow." Rachel tried to keep her voice steady, not wanting to worry him with her own anxiety about flying with his condition. Mrs. Martinez arrived early the next morning to drive them to the airport, her ancient car creaking through the pre-dawn darkness. Matthew dozed in the back seat, while Rachel mentally rehearsed everything she needed to remember: his medications, medical records, emergency contacts. The airport was already bustling when they arrived, filled with business travelers and early morning flights. Rachel clutched Matthew's hand tightly as they navigated through check-in, her other hand gripping their paperwork. Each step felt surreal. They were actually doing this. At security, Matthew watched wide-eyed as their small suitcase rolled through the scanner. "Look, Mummy, it's like an X-ray," he exclaimed, drawing smiles from nearby travelers. His natural charm and innocent enthusiasm often touched strangers' hearts, making them forget the slight bluish tinge to his lips. As they waited at their gate, Rachel noticed a well-dressed man watching them with unusual interest. He sat several seats away, occasionally glancing at Matthew over his newspaper. There was something familiar about his face, but Rachel couldn't place it. When Matthew had a small coughing spell, the man's concern seemed deeper than mere curiosity. Finally, their boarding group was called. As they walked down the jet bridge, Matthew squeezed Rachel's hand tightly. "It's okay to be scared," she whispered, though her own heart was racing. "We're going to see the doctor who can help make you feel better." What happened next would change their lives forever, though Rachel didn't know it yet. As they found their seats, Matthew's eyes locked onto the man who'd been watching them at the gate. He was now sitting just across the aisle, and something about him captured Matthew's complete attention. The flight attendant was helping Rachel store their small bag when she heard her son's voice, clear and confident in a way she'd never heard before. The words he spoke would alter the course of their journey in ways none of them could have predicted. "Daddy?" Matthew's voice rang out clear in the crowded airplane cabin. His small finger pointed directly at the well-dressed man across the aisle, whose newspaper slipped from his trembling hands. Tears immediately welled up in the stranger's eyes as he stared at Matthew, recognition and shock written across his face. Rachel froze, her heart pounding. She'd been a single mother since before Matthew was born, never knowing anything about his father, except for a brief romance during her college days in Boston. The man across the aisle, with his dark curls and deep brown eyes so similar to Matthew's, was none other than Daniel Mitchell, the man she'd loved and lost 6 years ago. "I'm so sorry," Rachel stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. But Daniel wasn't looking at her. His eyes remained fixed on Matthew, who continued to stare at him with an uncanny certainty. The flight attendant, sensing the tension, quietly asked if everything was all right. "He looks exactly like my son would have," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The son I never knew existed." His hands were shaking as he gripped the armrests, knuckles white with tension. Rachel sank into her seat, memories flooding back. She discovered her pregnancy 2 weeks after Daniel had left for his medical residency in California. Her calls and messages had gone unanswered, and eventually his number was disconnected. She'd assumed he'd moved on, choosing his career over their relationship. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Daniel leaned across the aisle. "Rachel, is Matthew mine?" The way he said Matthew's name, having overheard it earlier at the gate, carried years of unspoken questions. Rachel nodded slowly, unable to speak. Matthew, oblivious to the tension, was happily showing Daniel his blue dinosaur. "His name is Rex," he explained seriously. "He helps me when my heart feels funny." Daniel's expression shifted from shock to concern. His heart. He glanced at Rachel, medical training evident in his quick assessment of Matthew's slightly bluish lips and the way he sometimes paused to catch his breath. "Congenital heart defect," Rachel explained quietly. "We're flying to Phoenix for a consultation with Dr. Harrison at Children's Hospital." She watched as recognition flashed across Daniel's face. "James Harrison? He's my mentor," Daniel said softly. "I'm a pediatric cardiac surgeon now. I'm heading to Phoenix to assist him with a complicated case." His voice trailed off as realization dawned. "Matthew is the patient he called me about, isn't he?" The revelation hung heavy in the air as the plane took off. Matthew, excited by the takeoff, grabbed both their hands, creating an unexpected physical connection across the aisle. Rachel felt tears sliding down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment. As the plane leveled off, Daniel shared his side of the story. He'd never received Rachel's messages. His phone had been stolen the day he left Boston. When he tried to contact her weeks later, she'd moved, and none of their mutual friends knew where she'd gone. He'd spent months searching before finally accepting that she'd chosen to cut ties. "I never stopped thinking about you," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the engine noise. "I threw myself into my work, specializing in pediatric cardiac surgery because— He paused, struggling with emotion. Because helping children with heart problems felt like a way to heal my own broken heart. Matthew, growing tired, leaned against Rachel's arm but kept his eyes on Daniel. "Daddy, can Rex come sit with you?" he asked sleepily, holding out his beloved dinosaur. The word "daddy" made Daniel's breath catch again, fresh tears threatening to fall. Rachel watched as Daniel carefully accepted the dinosaur, treating it with the same gentle respect he would show a patient's cherished possession. "I'd be honored to watch Rex for you, buddy," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. As Matthew drifted off to sleep, Daniel and Rachel talked in hushed voices. She learned that he'd remained single, unable to form lasting relationships because of their unresolved past. He'd built his career helping children like Matthew, never knowing his own son was out there needing exactly that help. "Dr. Harrison showed me Matthew's case file yesterday," Daniel revealed. "I stayed up all night studying it, feeling an inexplicable connection to this unknown patient. Now I understand why." He looked at their sleeping son with a mixture of awe and regret for the years lost. A flight attendant passed by, noting Matthew's sleeping form and quietly offering a blanket. As Rachel tucked it around him, Daniel noticed the worn edges of Matthew's clothes, the scuffed shoes, the way Rachel's uniform peeked out from her bag, all signs of their financial struggles. "Rachel, I need you to know something," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "Regardless of how this happened, I want to be part of Matthew's life, not just as his doctor, but as his father, if you'll let me." Before Rachel could respond, Matthew stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about his heart feeling funny. Both parents tensed, but Daniel's medical training took over. He quickly assessed Matthew's breathing and color, providing reassurance that he was okay. "He does this sometimes," Rachel explained, her voice tight with familiar worry. "The doctors say it's normal for his condition, but it terrifies me every time." She'd spent countless nights watching Matthew sleep, counting his breaths, praying for morning. Daniel reached across the aisle, gently taking her hand. "You've been so strong, carrying this burden alone. I can't change the past, but I promise you're not alone anymore." His words carried the weight of both apology and commitment. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing Matthew to wake briefly. He looked between Rachel and Daniel, a sleepy smile crossing his face. "Mommy, Daddy, and Rex are all together," he murmured before drifting off again, his innocent observation bringing fresh tears to both adults' eyes. As they began their descent into Phoenix, Rachel realized that this journey had become about more than just Matthew's medical consultation. Somehow her son's intuitive recognition of his father had set in motion events that would transform all their lives. Daniel clutched Rex the dinosaur, watching Matthew sleep. "I've performed hundreds of surgeries on children's hearts," he said quietly, "but I never imagined I'd one day be operating on my own son's heart." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication about what lay ahead. The Phoenix Children's Hospital loomed before them, its modern facade gleaming in the morning sun. Matthew, now fully awake, held both Rachel's and Daniel's hands as they walked through the entrance. His innocent joy at having both parents beside him contrasted sharply with the gravity of why they were there. "Dr. Mitchell," a nurse called out, stopping short when she saw him holding Matthew's hand. "I thought you weren't arriving until this afternoon for the case review." Her eyes darted between the three of them, noting the obvious family resemblance. "Change of plans, Marie," Daniel replied, his voice professional but tight with emotion. "This is Matthew Anderson, our complex cardiac case, and his mother, Rachel." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "He's my son." The nurse's eyes widened, but her professional training took over. She quickly led them to a private consultation room instead of the general waiting area. As they waited for Dr. Harrison, Matthew sat on the examination table, proudly showing Rex to Daniel and explaining how the dinosaur helped him be brave during doctor visits. Dr. Harrison's entrance halted their conversation. The older surgeon stopped in his tracks, looking between Daniel and Matthew, understanding dawning on his face. "Well," he said finally, "this explains your intense interest in this case, Mitchell." What followed was a detailed discussion of Matthew's condition. Rachel listened as the two doctors discussed surgical options, her hand gripping Daniel's unconsciously as they viewed the latest scans. The medical terminology was overwhelming, but one thing became clear. Matthew's case was more complicated than initially thought. "The good news," Dr. Harrison explained, "is that we can help. The bad news is that we're looking at a series of surgeries, not just one. The first needs to happen within the next few weeks. He glanced at Rachel, understanding the financial implications. Before Rachel could voice her concerns about costs and insurance, Daniel spoke up. "I want to be part of the surgical team," he stated firmly, "but not as lead surgeon. I'm too emotionally involved now." He squeezed Rachel's hand. "And I'll handle all the expenses." Just then, Matthew had one of his funny heart moments. Both surgeons sprang into action. Their movements synchronized as they checked his vitals. Rachel watched in awe as Daniel's medical expertise merged with paternal instinct, his touch both professional and tender. "Daddy makes my heart feel better," Matthew declared once the episode passed, causing everyone in the room to freeze. Dr. Harrison looked at his protege with new understanding, seeing both the doctor and the newly discovered father navigating this complex situation. As they discussed the treatment plan, a nurse rushed in with urgent news. A critical cardiac case had just arrived, a young patient who needed immediate surgery. Dr. Harrison was needed in the operating room right away. "Mitchell," Dr. Harrison said, "I need you to—" He stopped, looking at Matthew. "No, I'll call another surgeon. You stay with your family." But Matthew, wise beyond his years, spoke up. "Daddy should help the other kid," he said seriously. "Rex will stay with me and Mommy." He held out his dinosaur to Daniel, a gesture of both permission and trust. The next few hours brought the story's biggest twist. While Daniel was in surgery, Rachel met with the hospital's financial counselor. During their discussion, she learned something that shook her to her core. The consultation coordinator who'd originally reached out to her about Matthew's case had been trying to contact her for weeks about an anonymous donation that would cover all medical expenses. When Daniel returned from surgery, still in his scrubs, Rachel confronted him with tears in her eyes. "You knew about Matthew before today, didn't you?" she asked. "You saw his case file weeks ago and arranged everything. The donation, the consultation, all of it." Daniel sank into a chair, emotionally exhausted. "I suspected," he admitted. "When I saw his file, the age matched. The mother's name was Rachel Anderson. I did some research, found your photo online from the diner's website. I've been trying to find the right way to approach you." "So you arranged to be on our flight?" Rachel's voice wavered between accusation and amazement. "No," Daniel said quietly. "That was pure coincidence, or fate. I was supposed to fly out yesterday, but my flight was cancelled. When I saw you both at the gate—" He paused, overwhelmed by emotion. "I couldn't believe it. Then Matthew—" His voice broke. "Called you Daddy," Rachel finished softly. The magnitude of everything, the coincidences, the planning, the instant connection between father and son, overwhelmed her. Matthew, who had been napping, woke up and reached for both of them. "Can we get ice cream?" he asked sleepily, unaware of the emotional conversation he'd interrupted. "Daddy promised." "I didn't," Daniel started to say, but stopped. He hadn't actually promised ice cream, but somehow Matthew had known he would say yes, just as he'd known somehow that Daniel was his father. Dr. Harrison returned with news that would change everything again. "The surgery was successful," he reported, "but it's made me rethink Matthew's case." He looked at Daniel. "I want to revise our approach. And Mitchell, I think you should be the lead surgeon." "But I can't," Daniel protested. "He's my son." "Exactly," Dr. Harrison said. "You've studied his case more thoroughly than anyone. You have both the skills and the motivation to give him the best possible care. No one else will be as invested in the outcome." As they absorbed this news, Matthew tugged on Daniel's scrubs. "See, Daddy? You can fix hearts, just like you fixed mine today." The profound simplicity of a child's wisdom left them all speechless. In just 24 hours, a chance encounter on a plane had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. The road ahead would be challenging, but they would face it together. In the weeks that followed, Phoenix Children's Hospital became their temporary home. Daniel arranged for Rachel and Matthew to stay in a comfortable apartment near the hospital, insisting on handling all expenses. Rachel initially resisted but eventually accepted, recognizing that their son's health came first. Matthew's first surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The night before, Daniel sat beside his son's hospital bed, teaching him about hearts using a plush anatomy toy. "See, buddy, your heart is special, just like you," he explained, his voice gentle. "And tomorrow we're going to make it even better. Will you hold Rex during the surgery?" Matthew asked sleepily, clutching his dinosaur. He keeps Hearts safe. Daniel swallowed hard, taking the well-loved toy with trembling hands. Rachel, watching from the doorway, felt tears sliding down her cheeks at this tender moment between father and son. The morning of the surgery, Dr. Harrison pulled Daniel aside. "Are you sure you want to lead this?" he asked one final time. Daniel's response was unwavering. "I've spent my career fixing children's hearts while my own son needed me. I won't step back now." Rachel walked with them to the operating room doors, trying to stay strong for Matthew. "Mommy," he said suddenly, "don't cry. Daddy fixes hearts, remember?" His simple faith in his father moved everyone present. As they wheeled him away, Matthew clutched both their hands one last time before letting go. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Rachel paced the waiting room while Mrs. Martinez, who had flown in to support them, prayed quietly in the corner. Finally, Dr. Harrison emerged with news that brought them all to tears. The surgery had been successful. Daniel had performed flawlessly, his personal connection to the patient driving him to unprecedented precision. During Matthew's recovery, Daniel rarely left the hospital. He split his time between checking on their son and handling other cases, earning a reputation among the staff for his enhanced empathy with patients and their families. "Having Matthew changed everything," he confided to Rachel one evening. "I understand now what parents go through in a way I never did before." As Matthew grew stronger, Rachel noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. Daniel would bring breakfast for both of them each morning, his hand lingering when passing her coffee. They found themselves sharing quiet conversations late into the night, rediscovering what had drawn them together years ago while building something new. One evening, while Matthew slept peacefully, Daniel took Rachel to the hospital's rooftop garden. "I've been thinking," he said, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, "about all the years we lost, about how lucky we are to have this second chance." Rachel turned to face him, seeing both the young man she'd fallen in love with and the accomplished surgeon he'd become. "I never stopped loving you," she admitted softly. "Even when I thought you'd chosen your career over us, I couldn't hate you." Daniel pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm never letting you go again," he whispered. "Either of you. I want us to be a real family." He hesitated before adding, "I'm transferring to Minneapolis. Dr. Harrison's helping me set up a pediatric cardiac program there." 2 months after the first surgery, Matthew was strong enough to go home. His lips had lost their bluish tinge, and his energy levels improved dramatically. The day they left the hospital, the entire cardiac staff gathered to say goodbye, many wiping away tears as Matthew hugged each of them. "Remember, Rex helps hearts," Matthew told his father seriously, allowing Daniel to keep the dinosaur for all the other kids who need heart surgery. Daniel accepted this precious gift with the gravity it deserved, promising to keep it in his office for future patients. Back in Minneapolis, life transformed. Daniel bought a house near the hospital where he'd be working, with plenty of room for all of them. Rachel initially insisted on keeping her apartment, not wanting to rush things, but found herself spending more and more time at the new house. The staff at Joe's Diner welcomed Daniel warmly, especially after learning how Matthew had recognized him on the plane. Mike, the manager, took particular pleasure in telling customers the story of how their little Matthew had found his daddy among the clouds. 6 months after their fateful flight, Matthew had his final follow-up appointment. His heart was functioning better than anyone had expected, a testament to his father's surgical skill and his own resilience. To celebrate, they planned a special dinner at home. As Rachel prepared Matthew's favorite meal, she watched through the window as Daniel taught their son how to play catch in the backyard. Matthew's laughter rang out clear and strong, no longer interrupted by shortness of breath. On the porch, Rex the dinosaur sat watching, retired from hospital duty but still a beloved family member. "Mommy, come see," Matthew called out. Running outside, Rachel found Daniel on one knee in the grass, holding out a ring that caught the evening sunlight. Matthew stood beside him, grinning proudly, holding a small sign that read, "Say yes, Mommy." "I know this might seem fast," Daniel began, but Rachel stopped him with a kiss. "Fast?" She laughed through happy tears. "We've been waiting 6 years for this moment." Matthew cheered as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, then launched himself into their group hug. That night, after tucking Matthew into bed, they stood in the doorway watching him sleep. His breathing was steady and strong, his face peaceful. The moonlight streaming through his window caught the family photo on his nightstand, taken at the hospital after his first surgery, all three of them together for the first time. "You know," Daniel whispered, holding Rachel close, "I've performed hundreds of heart surgeries, but Matthew fixed my heart the moment he called me Daddy on that plane." Rachel leaned into him, remembering that life-changing moment when their son's innocent words had brought them back together. As they closed Matthew's door softly, they heard him mumbling in his sleep, "Daddy fixes hearts. Mommy fixes everything else." His unconscious words captured the essence of their journey, a story of healing, both physical and emotional, brought about by a child's unwavering faith and love. The next morning, as sunlight filled their kitchen and Matthew chatted happily over breakfast, Rachel looked at her family with wonder. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest miracles didn't require supernatural intervention, just a plane ride, a child's intuition, and hearts open to love's possibility of healing even the deepest wounds.